So how about we do away with this ridiculous conversation every couple of years and just get rid of it?
Well, I'm not quite there, actually, and here's the reason why. We need to replace the debt ceiling with something else, but it is actually the only fiscal constraint that exists out there. It's the only thing that pushes the pause button and forces Congress to decide what they're going to do because they are limited in how much they're borrowing. Like if they pass a budget, which they almost never do, there's no restraint on how much they borrow in that budget. There are no other real limitations that they ever comply with. There's something called statutory pay-go. They plowed right through it. They didn't even notice at the end of last year. So the debt ceiling is like the one speed bump into borrowing into oblivion. But as President Trump correctly said, it's too risky. We can't risk a default. So I agree with him that we should increase it. I'm not there on getting rid of it unless we replace it. But the one thing that I wish he would say, and this is the point that all of the fiscal conservatives who are talking about, oh, I'm never voting for a debt ceiling increase, should focus on is, how about they make a plan to not pass any legislation that has more borrowing, right? If they like spending cuts, if they think that the fiscal situation is bad, which it absolutely is, there should be an agreement by the Republicans right now, or by all lawmakers, honestly, of no new borrowing.
Let's hear from the Speaker of the House on this. Mike Johnson talked about his chamber's plans, Maya, for the debt limit and reconciliation and how they'll come together in this 119th Congress. Listen.
The intention is to handle the debt limit in reconciliation in the process, and that way, as the Republican Party, the party in charge of both chambers, we then get to determine the details of that. If it runs through regular order and regular process, and as a standalone or as part of the appropriations, for example, then you have to have both parties negotiating, and we feel like we're in better stead to do it ourselves. So there is a broad range of opinion on that in our own conference, and we are working through that.
Okay, Maya, so regular order is out the window already. Is he right? Should this be handled in one massive reconciliation bill?
I think that's more of a political question than a policy question. From the policy perspective, I think reconciliation has tended and was intended to be used to reduce the deficit, and more recently it's been used to increase it. So I think from a policy perspective, they should go back and use it for deficit reduction. From a political angle, I would guess this is going to end up actually being two separate bills just because there's so many things going on. They have to fund the government in just a few months. They have to deal with whatever they want in reconciliation, tax cuts, and or the border, but also to what extent they're going to offset that. And there's a lot more concern this time than when the original tax cuts were passed because the fiscal situation is so much worse. Our debt is now 100% of GDP. It was 75% of GDP last time around. And then what they do about the debt ceiling when you have some members who are absolutely unwilling to lift the debt ceiling. And what's good, again, is this time around, they're also really pushing not to grow the debt by making sure that that reconciliation bill and those tax cuts are offset. But my guess is that the immigration border portion will be easier to pass. And I think they are likely to end up going back to that model of doing two separate bills. But nobody knows. Nobody knows.
Well, that's fascinating insight, though. And whether it's in one big, beautiful bill, as Donald Trump calls it, or in a later reconciliation bill, we're going to be managing the tax code here and the effort to renew the Trump tax cuts, which we've talked about a lot, and the committee has done great research on, considering the impact that it may have on our deficits. Maya, you add no tax on tips, you add no tax on overtime, Social Security, mortgage interest. I can't even remember half of them at this point. Then salt.
Get rid of salt,
add the layer of salt here for our viewers and listeners. This is going to be a much more difficult debate than it was in 2007.
It is going to be more difficult.
Or 2017, forgive me. I'll get my calendar right.
Yeah. Time has lost all meaning, hasn't it? It's so hard. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot more members this time who really feel uncomfortable with the fact that last time they passed the tax cuts, they absolutely supported the tax cuts, but they also supported spending cuts. And they did not do that. They did not include spending cuts. And in fact, under President Trump, there were 3 debt ceiling increases, all of which were paired with plans that increased spending and increased borrowing. So those fiscally conservative members are not as comfortable this time. And I think it is going to be a more difficult fight. Like you just said, they're adding more and more things to an already huge $4 or $5 trillion tax bill. They're layering on additional tax cuts when I would think the smartest way to think about this is smart pro-growth tax reform that's coupled with spending reductions or offsets, you should be paring back the least pro-growth parts of that tax bill instead of layering on new things.
You know, mentioning 2007 brings me back to a whole different period of time here. And that was, of course, the beginning of the Obama administration, 2008, healthcare reconciliation.
Yep.
When we talk about reconciliation this time around, Maya, how close to this version might we have once the Senate parliamentarian is done with this? Or will they be able to put all this policy into a budget vehicle?
That's right. As you understand, as you know, that in reconciliation, you're really only allowed to have policies that have direct budgetary impacts. And so you can't have policies that are extraneous. The parliamentarian has immense power here. I think a lot of the issues on immigration, it'll be interesting to see which things can be included and which things cannot be. We heard that the Senate is going to be strictly following what the parliamentarian says. That's very important. Reconciliation is an immensely powerful tool. If they did not have that, they would be looking at bipartisan policies, which would be just completely different from what we're about to see in terms of the focus on immigration and tax cuts. And it has traditionally been used to reduce the deficit, less so recently, less so for tax cuts. And I think we're going to see some discomfort with moving in a fiscally reckless direction and certainly not abiding by those general rules. That doesn't mean we won't see gimmicks. We're going to see a lot of gimmicks. We're going to see people trying to use baselines that are made up, pretending that policies exist when they actually don't. We're going to see magical growth numbers that people are assuming, and we're probably going to end up seeing truncated tax extensions where instead of making them permanent, which is how you should do tax policy, they're going to put them in for a few years to make the cost look much lower than it actually is.